Anyway, welcome to another edition of Friends, Food, and Faith. So I'm just going to share my screen here so we can take a look at this stuff together. As mentioned in the flock note, we kind of thinking about this as a prelude in a way to the Eucharistic Miracles, which are coming here to St. Gabriel in the gym on the 10th and 11th, so this Saturday and Sunday. On Saturday, I think it's from 7 to 5.
Yeah, maybe 7.
Yeah, and then Sundays from like 7 to 2. So pretty good time, open time to come and visit and see some of the commonality, but also the distinctions in all the Eucharistic miracles as well. So I thought it'd be good that we, as we're getting ready for this great exhibit to come to our parish that's been all over the world, the first thing is talk about what the Eucharist is. So firstly, the exhibits were actually put together by Blessed Carlos Acutis, who was born in 1991. He's the first millennial saint. He was actually Italian, but born in England. What's interesting about him is that he didn't really have a lot of faith life instilled in him from like his parents. He kind of did a lot of it on his own. He actually had a great devotion to adoration, to the Mass. And before he died, he actually put together this webpage we're now looking at. It's not maintaining anything but the people that upholding this cause, but he was maintaining this and started this, and it kind of includes all of the known Eucharistic miracles throughout the entire world. So as we see, it's all alphabetical order. See, there's one Argentina, which actually that one actually started a analysis, so to speak, of the current Eucharistic miracles to actually determine the validity of them. And this one, I'll just talk about this one because this was kind of the key one when it comes to the Eucharistic miracles themselves. Not they haven't happened before. Actually, there's plenty that happened all throughout time. If you look back here, you're going back to, some of you go back as far as the 3rd century. So you see here, like, 4th, 5th century, 3rd, 4th. So all throughout history, there's been these miracles that have happened all over the world, a lot in Italy, of course. And they all happen typically with like there's like one about every decade. So it's kind of amazing how many there have been over the course of this time. They all kind of have similar features. It usually centers around a lack of faith, whether by the priest that celebrated Mass or by the congregation. Typically what happens, either the host starts to bleed or it turns into a piece of flesh. So it's kind of a common occurrence in the Eucharistic miracles. That's kind of what happens. It's really more centered on the host, the body, but also some that with the blood, with the wine becomes the blood. Again, you can kind of look through these lists and see all through them. And what happened specifically in Argentina in the early 90s, let's say, there was a priest who was in a parish. He was at morning Mass, and a host fell on the floor. And so, being it's more of like a rural parish, they don't necessarily have a sacrarium. Sacrarium is that sink that goes down into the ground. That's the proper way to repose a host that's a consecrated host that's fallen on the floor, or maybe even wine that's been sopped up. Blood that's been sopped up off the floor. And so the priest though had an ablution dish, just a little glass of water, a little vessel of water. We have one next to our tabernacle. The little thing of water. It's called an ablution dish, and we usually primarily for our fingers when we're handling the Blessed Sacrament to purify our fingers, so that the body dissolves in the water. It only takes very long to do that, especially small crumbs. For a whole host, it might take about a day, give or take. So this priest having the morning Mass had the Mass, locked up the church, thinking to come back the next day and the host will be dissolved and no problem. So it comes back the next day and looks in the ablution dish, and what he finds is a bloody piece of flesh. Now, there was nobody that actually got into the church. It was completely locked up. There's no sign of forced entry. There was no damage anywhere to any of the locks or anything. So there was no way anyone could have gotten in there and actually changed out the host. So this priest, being a very astute person, decides to call his bishop, his archbishop. And the archbishop directs him to take the flesh and they took so the Archbishop Kostovic, they took samples and sent it out to 3 independent researchers, scientists, biologists, to actually give a determination of what it would be. Now, it's important to point out that each of these researchers, these scientists, none of them were Catholic or even Christian. They were completely objective, and they didn't know each other at all. So these are all 3 independent researchers, scientists that were doing this analysis. The analysis all came back the same. What they analyzed was that it was a piece of living cardiac tissue that was under great duress. You can tell by the striations that it was under great stress. And the blood type was type AB. Now, that started kind of this new development of, okay, well, shoot, maybe we should have these others analyzed. And what they keep on finding over and over and over again is that these consecrated body that we understand as Jesus, always it's a living piece of cardiac tissue under great duress, and the blood type is always AB. Now, why is AB significant? The AB blood type.
Universal receiver.
It's universal receiver, which is kind of interesting in the fact that the Son receives the love of the Father that generates a new person. But also, AB was the most common blood type in the Near East and the Mediterranean. So most people lived in Palestine, Judea, Israel, including the Blessed Mother, would have had AB blood. What's also fascinating about that is the same analysis was done on the Shroud of Turin. And that blood came back as AB blood. Interesting. But this analysis keeps on showing over and over the same things. And I'm not sure how many they've analyzed at this point. It's been, I think, a good number of them in this exhibit that's coming to our parish. But they all come back with those same results. Of course, people of faith would say all that does is show what we've always professed and believed about the Eucharist, that it is Jesus' body, blood, soul, and divinity. Others maybe question certain results. I mean, sure, obviously there's going to be skeptics no matter what, but to me, the overabundant analyses that have been done in this and shows over and over again the same results, that indicates to me there's something about these things. Okay. So as a prelude, I think it's probably, just kind of look at some of these. I mean, again, if you click on some of these links, it gives kind of some good details about what happened. Shows pictures of the different parishes and kind of just brief synopses of these particular instances. The other thing too to point out about this one in Argentina is the bishop that took custody of this host. His name was Mario Bergoglio. Does that sound familiar to anybody? At that time, he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, who then became a cardinal, and in 2013 was elected to the papacy. Francis.
Wow. That's right.
So, yeah, I actually gives even a kind of nice, interesting synopsis of where the tissue would have come from in the heart. So it's kind of, it's kind of amazing. We see again science kind of supporting our faith. The other thing that's also interesting about this particular one in Argentina is those independent, I think all of them that did the independent research actually converted to Catholicism. So it's an interesting scenario with a lot of these things. So yeah, so you can click through these and again, you can see how many there are all throughout the world. Croatia, I think the most recent one I think was in Poland. I don't know if they have that one.
I don't see
here.
the United States on there.
You don't. Now, why would that be significant? Yeah, Poland in 2008. That was I think the last one that's happened. Well, you can make two. Kind of conclusions about that, I guess, right? One, maybe we're just not holy enough for this would happen. But two, also the fact this usually occurs in a place where there's a lack of faith. Maybe that's a good sign. right? I don't know. You can take both ways, I suppose. That's not to say it will never happen in the United States.
Do you think there may have been others that aren't authenticated yet?
It could very well be the case. I mean, there also could be others that aren't actually recorded on here, right? I mean, you have to think about this too. He started this right before he passed away, and I think they're trying to add more as they come up on them. But I mean, also you could argue maybe there's some that's happened that haven't been recognized either. You know, I mean, to that point, there was someone that brought a host that found one of the pews here at St. Gabriel. That was kind of a common occurrence for a little while. I don't think it's happened in a while, but there were certain places where hosts were being left. Not sure if they're consecrated. We always assume they are, especially if you find them in the pews.
Right.
And it was brought to me, and so I made sure it dissolved in the sacrarium. Now, there was kind of some spots on it. Could have been mold, could have been something resembling flesh. I don't know. But I thought it proper to at least dissolve it, and it dissolved. So that would indicate, okay, that it's probably not flesh. Could other, maybe less scrupulous people find it and maybe dispose of the sacrament in another way? Sure. Is it possible that one of those had this miraculous event? Sure. You know, I'm not going to rule that out as a possibility. In fact, we just don't know. I mean, it's interesting. It happens like once a decade. That doesn't mean it has to be limited to once a decade. Maybe it happens more often than we think. How many people actually report it, or how many people actually go through with actually analyzing it? I don't know. But I think it is very interesting and curious that the results of these things always come back the same. And so that gives a lot of credence to the fact that what the Catholic Church professes about the Eucharist is true. So to that end, we are maybe just talk a little bit tonight about what the Eucharist is, why we profess it to be the body, blood, soul, and divinity. I think we've had similar conversations before, but I think it's always good to kind of bring these things up and maybe prepare ourselves as this exhibit comes to St. Gabriel. Great. So obviously the sacrament of the Eucharist is given to us by Jesus himself, and it was given to us when? Was that?
Holy Thursday?
Holy Thursday. When on Holy Thursday?
Last Supper.
Last Supper. Yeah. I mean, and so with any sacrament, we always have to take it in the context. It's usually a not necessarily one particular event. It may be initiated in one event, but actually culminates all the sacraments culminate in the cross. So you could say that yes, it was maybe instituted by Jesus Christ at the Last Supper. There were foreshadowing to it though throughout his entire ministry, but it culminated in the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. That through that ultimate sacrifice, it enlivened the sacraments and made them channels of grace for us. As the blood and water flowed from the side of Christ, so did the grace of the sacraments to us. But yes, instituted primarily at Last Supper. But we would say Jesus was kind of hinting at it even in his ministry. So we see that in the feeding of the 5,000, right? The feeding of the 5,000 was a Eucharistic action. From when many, the plentiful, the overabundance of the Eucharist is symbolized in the action of Christ in the multiplication of the loaves and fish, right? And even the discourse that comes out of that's only really recorded in the Gospel of John, right? So in all the other Gospels, they have a institution narrative, we call it, right? So Matthew, Mark, Luke, they talk about what happened at the Last Supper. They actually record what Jesus said, meaning this is my body, this is my blood, and really record very well all the surround of that Last Supper leading to his passion, death, and resurrection. John does not. In the book of John, the Gospel of John, you do not find a Last Supper narrative. Nowhere in John you read the words, "This is my body and this is my blood." He focuses a lot on the Last Supper. There's a lot of discourse around the Last Supper. We get the washing of the feet from John in the Last Supper, right? Which institutes the diaconate for his apostles. You get a lot of discussion of Jesus about him being the high priest, that he is the gate, and he and the Father are one, and we are all one in the Father and the Son, unified in our faith. A lot of great things happen at the Last Supper. They're not recorded in the other Gospels. But what John does in his catechesis on the Eucharist is talk about it in John chapter 6. So in John chapter 6, it starts with the feeding of the 5,000. It goes till sunset. Overnight, the apostles go across the sea. Jesus stays and prays. And at the third watch of the night, we hear that Jesus starts walking on the water. Now, that's a very significant action by Jesus. Does anyone know what that signifies?
Power and control.
Yes, primarily yes. What that harkens back to is Genesis. So in the book of Genesis, it begins by saying, in the beginning, the Spirit of God hovered over the abyss. Now, the abyss in ancient Hebrew thought was actually a symbol of chaos. So what those words mean in Genesis is that God brought order from the chaos, right? So whether you take Genesis literally, figuratively, allegorically, we would say that all we can really say for certain that is uniform is that God created order out of chaos. He brought something out of nothing. So by Jesus showing his command over the sea, over the air, over the water, over the abyss, what he's telling his apostles is, yeah, you know that guy that did all this stuff in the very beginning? This is this guy right here. That's me. That was me. That spirit that hovered over the abyss, yeah, I am that one that was doing that, right? So that would have been known by the apostles. That's why they were so fearful, because wait a minute, this is supposed to be a ghost, because other quilts than a ghost can walk on the water, right? They don't have a body. But then there's this realization, oh, okay, yeah, wait, that's Jesus. Oh, whoa, hey, wait a minute. That thing he just did yesterday, okay, there's something to this guy, right? Then the next day, what happens is the people that can on the other side of the shore, they wake up and say, hey, where'd Jesus go? Well, he fed us yesterday. I bet if we go follow him again, he may do the same thing today, right? Why do I got to work for my food if I can go follow this guy around and get fed all the time? Awesome, let's go. So they catch up with him, and that's what they kind of approach him with. It's like, hey, where were you? Where'd you go? Right? But Jesus, before they say anything, Jesus is like, yeah, you guys followed me because you're hungry again. You're hungry yesterday, and I'm hungry again. That's what you want. They're like, well, yeah. I mean, it's good. What can you give us? He's like, well, then he's like, well, I'll give you the bread that comes down from heaven. And that harkens then back to Exodus, right? The manna in the desert. And so the people are like, yeah, great, awesome, we'll take that. Yeah, we don't have to work for our food anymore. That's great. Just give us the manna. It's like, well, no, but the manna I give you is food from heaven. And if you were ended there, there's some sort of figure. You could say, well, Jesus speaking figuratively like he usually does. He's telling a parable. He's not talking about a physical food. He's talking about spiritual nourishment. Okay, got you, right? Get it. I got it, Lord. But he doesn't end it there, right? He keeps on taking them farther and farther in. And the next thing he tells them is like, yeah, well, the food that I give you is going to be my flesh for the life of the world. What? wait, what? Yeah, you're going to have to literally gnaw on my flesh and drink my blood if you want eternal life. We're out. So we're talking about cannibalism, right? Yeah, I think that's where we're going to draw the line there, Jesus. The bread and fish thing was really cool, but if you're telling me if I can never go hungry again and live eternally, if I have to eat your flesh and drink your blood, no, I'm good, thank you. What's very interesting about that interaction that he doesn't stop them. He lets them all leave with that thought. He doesn't say, oh, wait a minute, look, give me about 3 more years, or maybe 2 at that point, who knows? And you'll know what I mean. When I'm on that cross, you guys will know what I'm talking about. Just hold tight. He doesn't say any more. They all go. And then he doubles down. He then turns to his 12 apostles and says, you guys want to go too? Are you guys out? Right? And the fascinating thing is Peter sticks up and says, well, where are we going to go? Right? Look, I'll trust you. I mean, maybe you mean cannibalism. I don't know. I'm going to trust you're going to tell us eventually what's going to happen. You say, eat your flesh and drink your blood. I guess you're going to tell us how that happens, how that works. And then, of course, the Last Supper, he does. Right? That's what's so fascinating about John. And when we get into discussions with our Protestant brothers and sisters, especially those that think of this Eucharist just a symbol, you can't read John chapter 6 and then say, oh yeah, Jesus is speaking figuratively. He's talking about a parable. You can't. You can't literally, you can't even allegorically say that's what he's saying. Because if he were, he would tell his apostles that. And he wouldn't let the people leave after he told them what he was going to do. That doesn't make any sense. This one say, Mariel? So then in the context of the Last Supper, it all comes to fruition. Oh, this is my body. This is my blood. And then do this in remembrance of me. Those three lines have to go together. Because in one fell swoop, he not only gives us himself to us in this living sacrament of his body and blood, but also gives us the means of actually confecting that sacrament over and over and over again in the priesthood. Cool. So that's why we say that the Eucharist is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. It has to be. That's just biblically speaking. Philosophically speaking, we have more to say about what the Eucharist is, right? And that is a little bit harder maybe to wrap our heads around, right? So in order to understand this, we kind of have to understand the different aspects of existence, right? So primarily philosophically speaking, everything that exists is made of matter and form, okay? Or substance is essence, if you will. They're kind of similarly used. There is a distinction, but primarily that's what we're talking about, right? So in other words, there has to be some stuff and something to give some shape or some existence, some being to the stuff, right? So in other words, I have this stuff that makes a chair, we call it wood and fabric and whatever else, but it doesn't become a chair until it takes on the form of the chair. And form is very difficult to name. The essences of things are very hard for us as humans to determine. Because if I were to ask you, let's say Jane, what is the form of that chair? What is the essence of that chair? Yeah, it's hard, right? Because you can tell me what's made out of wood. Okay, well, that's the material existence of it. Sure, great, good. Well, it's used to sit on. Okay, well, that's the purpose of it, which is good. And they're all, entwined in some way. But to say what actually gives this chair being? Existence. The chairness. That's what the best we can do, right? Well, there's a chairness to it. That's all. That's about it. Which also separates us from angels, because angels can actually tell you what the essence of the chair is. We cannot, right? So the same thing happens with the Eucharist. We have this matter, the substance, this bread and this wine that we use, right? That Jesus uses. But the very existence, the very being, the very essence of it changes at the consecration to the essence, the breadness and the wineness of it, to the Jesusness of it. Right? It's the only thing in the entire universe that changes its existence, but not its accidents, not its attributes. So if I were to take an axe of this chair and turn it into a pile of wood, you say, oh yeah, you turn the chair into a pile of wood, right? It's still got chairness to it. You can still be able to sit on it, but it's now something that's different in its very accidents and attributes. Good. I can burn it down to ashes and say, well, it's still wood. It still has the kind of this existence to it, but it's not the same as it was before. The Eucharist, the very opposite happens to it. it retains all its attributes, all its sensual attributes to it. You can still look at it, it looks like bread, it smells like bread, it tastes like bread, it feels like bread, right? But it's not. It's actually Jesus himself. Right? We call that transubstantiation, right? The matter form change, the substance of it changes, but it still retains all of its look, its feel, its sensual actions, right? Now, we start to differ with some of our Protestant brothers and sisters in this. And it makes sense because in everything else in nature, even supernatural, the essence of a higher order always consumes that of a lesser order. So we think about like whenever a cow eats a blade of grass, right? That grass no longer exists in that current form. It changes to something else and becomes part of the cow in that way. And then when we eat the cow changes form and becomes part of us. Our protein, our muscle, right? We gain something from that cow that then becomes part of us, right? To the point where even we consume the Eucharist, that becomes part of us, but then Jesus consumes us in it. Because that's the higher nature of it, the higher essence.
Repeat that now. So when
we consume the Eucharist, right, it becomes part of us, but yet we become part of Christ.
Okay.
Right? As the body of Christ, unified in that action. So the same holds then for the Eucharist. So now other people might say, well, no, there's maybe an action of the Holy Spirit there that doesn't necessarily obliterate the essence of the bread, but there's sort of maybe a shared existence between the bread and Jesus. Now, philosophically, that makes no sense, right? Is it possible? Sure, God can make anything possible, but why? Why would God do that, right? That wouldn't necessarily make a logical sense of what the Eucharist would be. In the same way, when Jesus became man, Jesus could have obliterated his human nature and just maintained a divine essence in like a human shell, right? He could have done that, but he didn't. He maintained two natures, right? The human and the divine. But one still took precedent, the divine, right? So we would imagine the same thing would happen in the Eucharist, right? That the divine essence would then take precedent over a much lower nature. Because at least with a human nature and a divine nature, there is kind of a shared commonality in the fact that we all have intellect. But in the case of a non-living being, well, of course, the higher nature would take precedent over that. Does that make sense? Yeah. So we want to we don't necessarily have to disagree with our Protestant brothers and sisters that God could allow that to happen. But we would have probably a more logical understanding of like, well, why would he do that though? I mean, yeah, he could share nature with bread, but you could say the same thing about anything. I mean, Jesus could have come to us as a cow, or an ant, or a dog, or an angel, but he didn't. There's a logic to that, and there would also be a logic to understanding this action of God in the Eucharist, right? So we would hold that as Catholics that there's a transubstantiation, not a consubstantiation, which is what our Protestant brothers and sisters may hold in that respect. And so we can truly say we are not just devouring a piece of bread, we're actually devouring Jesus himself. Right? Same thing with the wine. We have to hold also, there's certain aspects of the sacrament that we have to hold dear, right? So every sacrament has a common elements, meaning there's always matter, form, minister, and recipient. So every sacrament has those four elements. In some cases, some are the same. In other cases, but except for one case, all of them are different. The one sacrament where some of them are the same is the sacrament of marriage. In marriage, the matter, the man and woman, The minister, the bride and the groom, and the recipient, the bride and the groom, are the same. In every other sacrament, they're distinct, different things. So for the Eucharist, what is the matter? What's the stuff?
Bread and wine.
Bread and wine. And for the Roman rite of the Catholic Church, we use unleavened wheat bread and grape red wine, preferably red. Doesn't have to be red, but preferably red, for that symbolism of the blood. Right? Other rites may use leavened bread, like for instance, our Eastern brothers and sisters, in like the Ukrainian rite and the Ruthenian rite, they usually use leavened bread. Why? That's just the tradition they had since the very beginning of the founding of their church. The reason the Roman rite uses unleavened bread is because that's what Jesus used, right? If we go back to the Passover supper, which is what that celebration was, the people of the Passover used unleavened bread because they were in a rush. They were trying to get out of Egypt. They didn't have time to let the dough rise. They had to get out of there, right? So every Passover celebration uses unleavened bread. And so the Roman rite of the Catholic Church does too. Does the Catholic Church have the authority to change that? Sure they do. If they want to say, yep, we'll start using leavened bread, fine. If they want to say we want to start using Oreo cookies, okay. I don't know if that's the best thing to do, but all right, they have that authority, they can do that. But the church has always held, well, if Jesus didn't change it, well, we probably shouldn't either, right? Which is probably a good tack to have.
When you say the church has the authority,
Yes.
what individuals does that specifically mean?
Well, primarily the Holy Father. He can make a edict that's infallible and say, now he would have to justify that in some way. I don't know if you justify Oreo cookies other than, hey, it tastes sweet, it's good. It's like manna. Oh yeah, maybe I don't know. You can make the argument, I suppose. I don't know. But yeah, the Pope or an ecumenical council in union with the Pope could certainly make that determination. They have the capacity to do so. Will they? Probably not. I would say probably not, because is it possible? Sure. Is it probable? No. Right. But they have full competence to make those determinations.
The ecumenical council, who are part of that? Or who?
So ecumenical council involves all the bishops of the world, right? Including our Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters. But it doesn't become doctrine or dogma until the Pope promulgates it. So in other words, the bishops all got together and said, yeah, you know what, I think it's proper to use Oreo cookies for the matter for the Eucharist. Holy Father, we submit this to you for your promulgation. And the Holy Father would then say, you guys are nuts, no way, we're not gonna do that. Okay, doesn't happen, right? That's the role of the Pope. He is really the one that makes the teaching infallible. Once he promulgates it, it then becomes infallible. If he doesn't promulgate it, it doesn't become infallible. That's happened before in the history of the church too. And praise God it has, right? It kept us out of error. Awesome. But the Pope, in line with the bishops, has that authority for sure. Okay, the form. The form is always the words that say what's happening to the matter. So in the Eucharist, what is the form?
The words of consecration.
Which are what?
This is my body, this is my blood.
This is my body, this is my blood. Those words have to be said at minimum for it to be a valid Eucharist. So the faithful also have a role in that. If the priest screws up, the faithful actually have an obligation to let the priest know that. Typically it's a server, another minister, and then the priest has the obligation then to redo the rite correctly. Right? If one were to hear the words not said properly, and then still go up and receive the Eucharist, that's a desecration. It's not good.
I've never heard that though.
So it would be be the people's fault? Or
Well, it would be, so let's say,
I mean, they know that it was.
let's say I were not ordained and I was sitting in the congregation here at St. Gabriel. And I don't know, let's not pick on anyone here currently. Let's say,
A visitor,
all right.
visiting priest.
Okay, fair, yeah, visiting priest comes in, from one of these crazy orders they have, they don't really know what's going on, or remain nameless. And they come in, the priest says, that's my body and that was my blood. Now, I in the congregation hear him say that. And I don't go up and say anything. And I go up to receive whatever he did and consume that. That should bear on my conscience a lot, because I know that's not Jesus, and I just try to simulate a sacrament that I know is not actually valid. I should have the charity and the courage to approach the altar, maybe during the fractioning rite or whatever, and say, Father, I don't think you said that right. Oh, I did. Okay. I go sit back down, I don't receive. Because I know better, right? And it happens sometimes. I mean, this priests get up there, they start doing their thing, and they maybe get riled up and don't pay attention to what they're doing. They don't say the right word, or they may skip over the words. I've heard that happen before too.
Really?
Not personally, but I've heard it happen, right? And I've never witnessed it, but I've heard it happen. And so now some priests have the actual wherewithal, like maybe did I say that? And usually the server's not paying attention either. So it's kind of like, but if there really is a concern, the priest has the obligation to redo it. Start probably from the epiclesis and start moving forward down. So they have to say those words regardless. Yeah, so it's very important. Minister. Who's the minister of the sacrament?
Priest,
Or?
Eucharistic minister, extraordinary minister, deacon.
Whoever could consecrate.
The minister is always the person that says the words.
So it's always the priest.
Or is the priest the only, well, so, okay, you're right in some ways. Is there anyone else in the hierarchy that would say those words other than a priest?
A bishop?
Bishop.
Oh.
Yeah, thank you. I mean,
But
you're not wrong, because every bishop is a priest, that's true, but but a priest or bishop, yeah. And then the recipient, who would be the recipient of the sacrament?
The congregation, the parishioners.
Hopefully.
But also the priest.
Sure, hopefully, yeah, really hopefully, or else it wouldn't be valid. So that's the other thing too. The priest has to consume the bread, the body and the blood that has been consecrated at that mass for it to be licit. Maybe invalid. Yeah, because they have to complete the sacrifice, so the priest would have to do that. So that's another thing to pay attention to too. But that's up to the priest. You guys probably wouldn't see that anyway. Are there any, so can anyone just come up willy-nilly and receive the Eucharist? It's no big deal, whoever is in the congregation?
No.
No. So there are certain criteria for someone to receive the Eucharist, right? First and always.
Be in the state of grace.
Okay, yes, that's one of them. That's a good thing, but probably even before that.
No mortal sin.
Well, that's what state of
Okay.
grace would be, yeah. So baptized.
Oh.
Have you baptized to receive the Eucharist? You can't be unbaptized. Well, you can, but that wouldn't be good for you or anybody else, right? So baptized, state of grace, meaning you have no mortal sin in your soul. And if you do, you go to receive sacramental confession before you receive the Eucharist. And the second, really, this is the second one. This one's kind of tricky in some ways, right? And this also is why we would say that people who are un-Catholic also can receive the Eucharist. Although you could make the argument that they believe that they say this, they're also Catholic too. So we can go, that's a discussion maybe. But the other criteria is they have to believe what the Catholic Church believes and professes about the Eucharist. That is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ, consecrated at the hands of a validly ordained priest. Now that raises some very interesting questions, right? So for instance, let's say a Lutheran, a practicing Lutheran, a good Lutheran comes into our church and says, yeah, I believe that's Jesus. because some Lutherans do. I believe that's actually the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. I believe he's truly present there in the Eucharist. I believe that is a validly ordained priest that has actually consecrated that. And as far as I know, I'm in a state of grace.
He's not baptized.
Well, Luther can be
Oh,
baptized,
okay.
sure. Let's say for the sake of this argument, he is
Okay,
baptized,
he is
right?
baptized.
For sheep.
Well, let's say he's had the baptism of desire.
That's a tricky one.
Ooh.
That's a tricky one, right?
You mean
Because
that-
how could that be objectively known?
He's the only one that knows.
And God,
No.
right? So you're right. I mean, that could be a possibility, but I think we would want to have that sacramental baptism applied. In the Lutheran Church, they understand that too. So there might be different non-denominationals or other maybe Pentecostal churches. Mormons, that might be an issue. But we would say that should be sacramentally baptized. So we have to understand the desire portion of these things. That's more for their particular judgment. So in other words, that takes hold at the moment of someone's death. Not necessarily at that moment right there at that time. Right? And that's the difference between like baptism by blood, baptism by desire, baptism by sacramental baptism is, I know when I'm baptized, I'm sure I have that grace. I know that for sure. Done. End of story. Do not pass go. With the sacraments by desire, we hope for that, but that's an issue between the person and God. And that would only be revealed at the person's particular judgment. Right? So in other words, can someone have a desire for baptism and not know it? Yeah, they could, right? That may be revealed to them at the moment of their death, and good, we hope for that, but I would not know that. So in the same instance, we would say then even the reception of the Eucharist by desire should be sufficient too for that person. So until they actually receive the actual sacramental baptism, they should refrain from going to receive the Eucharist. But they can still participate in the Eucharist by desire, a spiritual communion. Sure, good, great. And would God supply that grace? Yeah, sure, we trust in that. Will we know that for sure? Not until we're actually dead. But yeah, we hope so, right? Good. But case in point, we have this Lutheran who's baptized in the Lutheran Church, validly baptized. He believes or she believes in the Eucharist and what the church professes about it. State of grace? Well, maybe. Because what is the definition of being in a state of grace? Or I should say, what's the definition of committing mortal sin? You do something wrong, you have full knowledge of it, and you do it anyway. So is it possible that a well-meaning Lutheran could be in a state of grace? Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Because their conscious thing is telling them that they aren't. If their conscious telling them they aren't, or they are in a state of grace, okay. I can't judge that. So could that Lutheran then present themselves to receive the Eucharist in the Catholic Church?
Maybe.
Yeah. I would say yes, they could. Now, should a Catholic present themselves in the Catholic Church if they don't meet one of those criteria? No. But how many do? I don't know. I can't judge that. I know that our confession lines aren't as long as they used to be. So maybe that means that people aren't sinning as much. Praise God. Maybe that's the case. Or it could be that people just aren't well catechized. Part of it's cultural. I think it's fascinating that when I was still in Charleston, South Carolina, this was right when I was still discerning the priesthood, and I was actually getting ready to come back to St. Louis. And at that point, I was going to daily mass. And the only mass I could make it to that particular day was at 7 p.m. at my home parish. And this parish, it was very diverse ethnically. So a lot of different people from different backgrounds. It was really kind of cool. And I went to mass this one evening, and it was packed, wall to wall. And I was the only white guy there, right? A lot of Latino, Hispanic people filled the pews. It was the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And of course, they were all the Latinos were there, which was beautiful to see. I was only one of 10 people to go to receive the Eucharist. And I was shocked in a way, because I was like, there had to be at least 1,000 people there. And only 10 went up to receive the Eucharist. At the end of Mass, I kind of pulled the priest aside, Father, did I miss something here? Like, it's like, oh, they're all Latino. I'm like, yeah.
What does that mean?
Right. He's like, well, they didn't have a chance to go to confession. So if they haven't gone to confession, they're not going to receive the Eucharist. Blew my mind. Blew my mind. Yeah, I think a lot of Filipino people are the same way. Right? There's understanding of what the Eucharist is and how important it is to be in that state to receive Him. Whereas, unfortunately, I think people who have more European background, the line's moving, I guess we better go up. I think the difference is that Catholics should know better. That's, I think, the heart of these things. We should know if we're in a state of grace or not. And I have to say, I know I'm not all the time. Now, I try to get confession as soon as I can, if I'm in this state. But how should I say this? Part of the burden and part of the beauty of being a priest is that the sacrament does not rely on the sanctity of the priest. So I'm still required to make an act of perfect contrition if I am in a state of mortal sin before I celebrate Mass. Which is good, because it's not for my sake, it's for the sake of the people that are being ministered to. But the sanctity does not depend on the sanctity of the priest. Praise God for that, or else we'd all be screwed. Right? But we should all be in that state, regardless. So that's when we have our state candidates. It's kind of difficult because when we start talking about the Eucharist, like, can I receive it now? And it's like, maybe. And my usual counsel is I prefer you maybe go through our morality portion first. That way you can actually discover if you are or not. And then actually have a chance to go to confession. Because that really should be the proper way of doing it. I mean, what's very interesting is like our second graders. Well, okay, technically they have to be in an age of reason, which means they know the difference between right and wrong. Are all of them really in that state? I don't know. Does that actually bar them from receiving the Eucharist? Not technically. Are they in a state of grace? Well, maybe, because if they don't know any better, they may be. Right? So like when we have parents that contact me and their child is in first or second or even third grade, I just make a determination when it comes to like baptizing them. And so I usually meet with parents, meet with the child, and I ask some questions. Like, so, hey, if you saw someone robbing a bank, what would you do? Call the police? Okay, why? It's wrong. Why? Oh. Okay. Well, what if that person was starving? I mean, you gotta have to look at these things because that determines if they actually know what they're talking about. I would say most of them don't. So that means the good news is I can baptize them right away without going through any more catechesis, right? The bad news of that may be, are these kids actually receiving the Eucharist in a state, or are they even in a place where they should be going to first confession? I don't know. That's a tough one. We trust in God's providence in these things, I guess, and trust also that teachers are preparing them well. Could be. What's kind of the fun one I usually get now, and this is not breaking the seal because it's I'll tell this publicly. Talk about going to mass on Sunday. You know, it's like, you know, over the summer there was a group of kids that were stopping me and asking for candy, and so I started making a deal. I was like, well, I'll give you a piece of candy if you guys go to mass on Sunday, or at least ask your parents to go to mass on Sunday, right? So I bought these candy bars, you know, whatever, getting ready for the anticipating. Oh, great, they must have gone to mass, whatever. And so I go the next week and, oh, can I have a piece of candy? Did you go to mass? No. Did you ask your parents to go to mass? No. Well, then I'm not giving you a piece of candy. What's kind of fascinating is, well, could you go to mass by yourself? No. Okay. But then that weekend, you'll see them up here playing on the blacktop. You know, ride their bikes and wherever else. And it's like, now maybe their parents are telling them they can't go to mass by themselves. Maybe I'll assume that may be the case. I don't know. But it's kind of odd that you can let your child go and play up on the blacktop for hours on end, but they can't go to mass for an hour by themselves. I know.
Say it,
Yeah.
say it.
So yeah, it's infuriating, it's frustrating, it's interesting. But also, can I hold those kids accountable in those moments? Are they in the state of grace? Maybe. I don't know, because it's not necessarily their decision in this respect. It's not a full consent. You could argue that. The parents? I don't know all the circumstances there either, so I can't say for sure. But I don't think I'd represent myself, you know.
They have a sporting event they have to go to.
Well, that was kind of the top of my homily this morning. We it was kind of reiterating of the gospel this past weekend. You know, you're not, you know, those who love father, mother, daughter, sister, you know, they're not worthy of me. And so I kind of brought that up. It's like, yeah, you know, it's funny. I see you off the blacktop here, you know, while mass is going on. Why do you guys go and play the blacktop on the weekend? Which is great, cool. How many of us are going to mass on Sunday? Like, well, maybe it's not your fault. And I kind of said that. I was like, you know, maybe your parents aren't letting you go. Maybe you're going somewhere else. Maybe. I don't know if anyone was listening, but we'll see. I don't know. But yeah, so when it comes to the Eucharist, I mean, you have to be in those three criteria for the recipient, which doesn't negate someone who is not Catholic. Now, also too, you have to be kind of mindful. So if you went down the street to St. Thomas and received the Eucharist there, could you?
It's not a consecrated, it's been provided Jesus.
At St. Thomas Orthodox, Romanian Orthodox Church? They use the same manner as the Catholic Church. They use the same form as the Catholic Church. They have a validly ordained priests in the Eastern Orthodox churches. There's requirements for the recipients are still the same.
Do they have confession?
Mm-hmm. The Orthodox churches have all the same stuff. Basically, everything we have. The only difference between us and the Orthodox is our understanding of the papacy.
Okay.
And even then, there's more of an understanding now than there was like 50 years ago. And we're kind of seeing, we're saying the same thing in different languages for the most part. Could you receive Eucharist at St. Theodore's or Thomas's down the street?
What if there were no other alternative? Would that make a difference?
Sure. Let's say that were the case.
Yeah, if you met all the three criteria like you do for the Catholic Church, why not?
Sure, I would say that's no problem. Even if it weren't the last resort. You go
So
to,
if I decided their masses were more convenient, I could,
now, you could from our, now, the church would say you probably shouldn't. Not because you're barred from doing it from our understanding of what the Eucharist is, or what the Eucharist is even there at the church. But out of respect for their tradition. Because they may not want you to come to receive the Eucharist.
well, they might want to welcome me.
Maybe. And if that were the case, we would have no issue with that. Yeah, I mean, to your point, let's say you were in Greece. There are no Catholic churches in Greece. There's maybe 2 in the entire country, maybe. And so if you're there on a Sunday and you have no other alternative, well, of course, go to the Greek Orthodox Church. Now, should you receive Eucharist at the Greek Orthodox Church? We would say, you can validly, but you probably shouldn't, out of respect for the Greek Orthodox Church. But if you go ahead of time, say, go to the priest and say, Father Athanasius, I'm a Roman Catholic, may I receive the Eucharist here? And they say, sure, great. Awesome. We would be respectful though of that tradition. Plus, ecumenically, it's good to do that because we're so close with each other. Now that might be different though than going down to Ascension on the corner. Could you go to that church and receive communion?
Just be receiving a piece of bread.
Yeah, right. I mean, because the problem there is,
There's no transubstantiation.
well, there's no valid
For
ordination,
the
Okay.
priest.
right?
Okay.
So even though they may have a Lutheran minister who maybe wears the same thing as a Catholic priest, and they may even say, "This is my body, this is my blood." Okay. So yeah, to your point, well, yeah, I'm just receiving a piece of bread and drink of wine. Cool. What's the big deal? Well, maybe not much, but the thing to consider there is scandal, right? So let's say, I don't know, Maryland, you go down to the Ascension for a funeral or something, or a wedding. And there are other Catholics there at that wedding. And you go up and receive communion, and yeah, good to go. Could you lead someone to believe that's the same things that happens here in the Catholic Church?
Easily.
You could. Do we want that to happen? No. So we want to also respect for that tradition, sure. But because of the nature of what's happening there compared to the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church, we would say you want to refrain because of scandal. Make sense? Good. Well, I don't know, that might be it for the night. Any questions, comments, concerns, heresies? We kind of covered a lot. I mean, better understand the Eucharist. So we have understanding theologically, philosophically, biblically of what the Eucharist is. And that's why we would say that it's the body, blood, soul, and Jesus Christ. Right? That flows from the sacrifice of Christ on the altar, that was instituted at the Last Supper by Jesus, and has been handed down for generations through the apostolic succession of laying on of hands of validly consecrated priests. So good. Good prelude, I guess, for the Eucharistic Miracles. So good to go. Great. Well, thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Yeah.
You too.